What happens when ambition collides with ethics? Avery, a driven law student, is on the verge of exposing the corruption of a powerful lobbying firm until she accidentally crosses paths with Julian Sinclair, its influential CEO. As their worlds intertwine, both are forced to confront the boundaries between love, loyalty, and the truth. Will Avery's pursuit of justice tear them apart, or will Julian's secrets change everything? You won't believe where their story leads. Don't miss the twists and turns. Subscribe to our channel now to follow their journey. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the little cafe nestled just off the edge of Georgetown University's main campus. The scent of espresso lingered in the air, blending with the faint aroma of worn textbooks and anxiety. Avery Kim stood behind the counter, her hair twisted into a slightly messy bun, her apron streaked with a smudge of chocolate syrup from the earlier rush. She'd barely had time to breathe between work shifts and reviewing for her jurisprudence final. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. A stack of flashcards, color-coded and crammed with handwritten legal theory notes, peeked out from behind the register like they were begging for attention. The line moved steadily until a man stepped up who didn't quite match the usual crowd of undergrads and over-caffeinated professors. Tall, sharp in a tailored charcoal overcoat, his presence seemed to pull a pause from the background hum of the cafe. His salt and pepper hair and the subtle glint of a silver watch hinted at status, but not arrogance. He offered a polite, neutral smile. "One double espresso, please," he said, his voice calm and clear, with the practiced cadence of someone used to speaking in boardrooms. Avery nodded, half distracted. "For here or to go?" "To go," he replied. She rang it up, quickly scribbled on the order slip, then glanced at the next customer. Her hand reached behind the register for the receipt, but instead picked up a small folded card with blue ink scrawled across it. Legal positivism versus natural law, Hart's theory re-examined. She tucked it into the sleeve of the coffee cup without noticing, sliding it across the counter. "Here you go. Have a good one," she said automatically, already turning to take the next order. The man took the cup, glanced at the name, Julian written in careful, loopy script, and offered a small nod before stepping away. It wasn't until 10 minutes later, after the small wave of customers had ebbed, that Avery looked down at the counter and froze. "Oh my God," she muttered, snatching up the real receipt. The note she'd written that morning, part of her frantic study session on legal theory, was gone. She checked her pocket, under the register behind the pastry display. Nothing. "Please tell me I didn't give that to someone." But she already knew she had, and it hadn't gone to a tired student or one of the adjunct faculty. No, it had gone to that man, the espresso, the expensive coat, the unbothered confidence. "Great," she groaned, dropping her head into her hands. "I just handed a random customer a breakdown of Hart's legal system instead of a receipt." Behind her, someone chuckled. "Maybe they'll find it enlightening." She didn't laugh. Somewhere out there, a stranger was walking away with a window into her over-caffeinated, overly academic brain, and she had no idea who he really was. The next morning dawned gray and cool, the kind of DC spring day that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to rain. Julian Sinclair sat in the backseat of his black car, the note in his hand again. Folded, creased, and a little smudged with coffee, it hadn't left his mind since he discovered it on his way to the office the evening before. He had originally planned to toss it, assuming it was some mistaken receipt or flyer, but the title had caught his eye: Legal Positivism versus Natural Law, Hart's Theory Re-examined. A faint memory stirred from his own law school days. He started reading, out of curiosity. By the end of the second paragraph, his curiosity had shifted to admiration. Whoever had written the note wasn't just regurgitating theory. They were challenging it, weaving in current events and even referencing comparative case law. It was sharp, unexpectedly sharp. So now he was back. The cafe was quieter in the morning, filled with low conversation and the soft tapping of laptop keys. The air smelled of cinnamon and ambition. Julian stepped through the door, the familiar chime barely audible over the whirring of the espresso machine. Behind the counter, Avery moved quickly, sliding a pastry into a paper bag and flashing a smile at a student in a Georgetown hoodie. She hadn't seen him yet. He stepped up to the counter, patient, waiting his turn. When she looked up and met his eyes, she froze. "You," she said before she could stop herself. He gave a faint smile. "Me." Avery flushed instantly. "Oh God, the note. You got the wrong thing yesterday. I am so sorry. I didn't realize until after you left." He held up the folded card between two fingers gently. "No harm done. In fact, it made for a more interesting read than my usual paperwork." She blinked, caught off guard. "You read it." "Of course, you make quite the case. I hadn't seen Hart picked apart like that in years." He tilted his head slightly. "You're a law student." "Yeah, second year. Finals week. Sleep deprived," she added quickly, as if to excuse the note's nerdiness. Julian chuckled. "Well, your note almost convinced me to revisit my own views on jurisprudence. That's impressive." She relaxed a little, the tension in her shoulders softening. "I mean, it was supposed to be for my own revision, not public consumption, but thanks." He offered a hand. "Julian Sinclair." "Avery, Kim." She shook his hand a bit awkwardly, noticing too late how calloused his palm was, not what she expected from someone who looked like he probably had assistants for everything. Julian glanced around. "Would it be all right if I sat for a bit? I have some time, and I'd like to know more about the person behind that argument." Avery hesitated, then gestured toward a side table near the window. "Sure, just give me 5 minutes, I'm on shift." He nodded. "Take your time." As she turned back to make a cappuccino, Avery felt her heart thudding in her chest. Who was this guy? He had an air of importance, clearly wasn't just passing through. And yet he was sitting here, curious, not about coffee, but about her. By the time Avery joined him at the small round table by the window, Julian had already removed his coat, revealing a dark gray suit that looked like it had been tailored for someone who didn't usually have time to sit and wait. He was scrolling through his phone, but the moment he noticed her approach, he locked the screen and gave her his full attention. "Sorry to keep you waiting," Avery said, slipping into the seat across from him, clutching her own hastily made latte. "No need to apologize," Julian replied. "I imagine you've had quite the morning already." "Only spilled milk once," she said with a small smirk. "It's been a good day so far." He smiled, amused by her dry delivery. There was a brief pause, just long enough to be comfortable. Outside, people moved past the window, students rushing to class, tourists following a map, a jogger with earbuds in. The world kept spinning, but the table between them held a strange stillness. "So," Julian began, tapping the folded note on the table gently, "do you always carry around dense philosophical attacks on Hart's theories, or was I just lucky?" Avery chuckled. "That was me trying to process one of the more frustrating chapters in my legal theory course. It wasn't really meant to be persuasive, more like aggressively trying to understand." "Well, it worked. You made me reconsider some of my assumptions, and I don't say that lightly." She tilted her head. "So you studied law?" "Harvard ages ago, practiced for a while, now I run a firm." "What kind of firm?" she asked casually, sipping her latte. Julian hesitated just a beat. "We deal in strategic policy, public affairs, lobbying mainly." Her eyebrows lifted just slightly. "That's a bit of a leap from legal theory." "It is," he agreed. "But in this town, law and politics are never too far apart." Avery leaned back, studying him. "And do you like what you do?" Julian met her gaze without flinching. "Most days, some days less. It's a complicated space, high stakes, lots of gray areas." "That's one way to put it." He smiled, sensing the subtext. "Let me guess. You're planning to be the kind of lawyer who hates what I do." I'm planning, she said carefully, to be the kind of lawyer who still believes law should serve justice, not just power. Their eyes held for a moment, not quite challenging, but definitely measuring. That's a rare kind of lawyer, Julian said, voice low, and a brave one. Avery looked down, tapping the side of her cup. Maybe a naive one. I don't think so, he said, without hesitation. Silence stretched between them again, this time more loaded, not uncomfortable, but aware. The air seemed to shift, as if both of them had just stepped a little closer to something unnamed. You're not what I expected, Avery said finally. Neither are you, Julian replied, and I've learned to pay attention when that happens. She smiled, a little uncertain but honest. Well, if you ever want to debate legal realism over espresso, I'm here Mondays, Thursdays, and finals week chaos. I'll keep that in mind, Julian said, standing slowly, slipping the note back into his coat pocket like a token. Don't let heart drive you mad. As he walked away, Avery watched him go, the tiniest thrill twisting in her stomach. She wasn't sure who Julian Sinclair really was, not yet. But she knew one thing. Something about him had just slipped past her usual defenses. And she wasn't sure if that was exciting or dangerous. It began with a coffee every Thursday, then somehow Mondays too. At first, their conversation stayed safely tethered to abstract ideas, case law, judicial philosophy, public policy theory. But over time, those talks deepened, became more personal, more revealing. One rainy afternoon, Avery slid into the cafe booth with wet sleeves and a highlighter smudge on her cheek. Julian was already waiting, phone face down, 2 coffees on the table. You look like you fought a textbook and lost, he said, amused. I am the textbook, she groaned, dropping her bag with a thud. Do you remember Marbury v. Madison? I had to brief it 5 times before I stopped getting lost halfway through. Julian chuckled. Judicial Review, a classic, you'll get used to it. I don't want to get used to just accepting what the court says, she muttered, warming her hands on the cup. I want to know when it's right, when it's actually fair. He leaned back slightly, watching her. That's why you're dangerous. You're not just memorizing, you're thinking. Isn't that the point? It should be, he said, but in the real world, thinking gets expensive. Later that week, he invited her carefully, with no pressure, to attend a public panel his firm was hosting on regulatory reform. She hesitated, unsure, but curiosity outweighed nerves. The event was held at a sleek conference space in DuPont Circle, glass walls and polished floors. Avery stepped into a room filled with navy suits, catered hors d'oeuvres, and the smooth hum of political maneuvering. Men and women milled about, exchanging clipped pleasantries and half-smiles. Power hummed in the air like electricity. Julian greeted her near the back, his presence somehow sharper in this environment. You made it. I almost didn't, she admitted, adjusting her tote bag. I don't exactly blend in here. Good, blending in is overrated. During the panel, she listened not just to the prepared remarks, but to the subtle way questions were answered, sidestepped, reframed. The language of influence was elegant but evasive. Julian spoke last. His words were measured, persuasive, and so precisely tailored she almost missed how much they didn't say. Afterward, as they walked out into the cool evening, she glanced up at him. You're really good at that. At what? Sounding like you're answering a question, without actually committing to anything. Julian smiled faintly. Welcome to D.C. They stopped at a crosswalk. Cars passed. A cyclist shouted. Somewhere, a saxophone played under a bridge. I don't know if I could ever do what you do, she said quietly. I didn't think I would either, he replied. A week later, she invited him jokingly at first to study with her. To her surprise, he said yes. He showed up at the law library with sleeves rolled, coffee in hand, and a not-so-secret delight in being back among footnotes and casebooks. As she tried to explain her latest mock trial assignment, He asked questions that forced her to see her own arguments differently. "Look at your closing argument," he said, reading over her shoulder. "You've got logic. What you need now is tone. Think less I'm right, more I understand." "You'd make a terrifying professor," she muttered, scribbling a note. "And yet you're still taking my advice." Through those moments, her messy desk and overworked mind, his slick boardrooms and curated statements, they began to understand each other. Not just their worlds, but the weight each carried, her urgency, his restraint. And though they never said it outright, something had shifted. Theirs wasn't just a passing connection anymore. It was becoming a mirror, uncomfortable, clarifying, real. It started with a pattern neither of them acknowledged. Julian would stop by the cafe on Mondays, just after Avery's morning shift began. He'd order something different every time, an Americano, a chai latte, once even a comically oversized croissant he claimed was for research purposes. Avery would pretend not to notice he was becoming a regular, though she'd always make sure his drink came out just right, extra foam, never too hot. On Thursdays, she started arriving 15 minutes early to work, just in case he came by before his day began. Sometimes he didn't, but when he did, he always looked slightly surprised, like he hadn't been hopping to see her too. "Fancy seeing you again," he said once, leaning casually on the counter. "It's a small city," she replied, "with very few cafes apparently." They kept it casual, but the rhythm formed naturally. A text now and then, an article forwarded with a dry remark, even an inside joke that grew out of a barista's disastrous attempt at latte art. That's not a heart, that's an abstract cry for help. And then there were the gestures, small ones, unspoken. Julian once left behind a worn paperback on the counter, The Common Law by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., with a sticky note inside. "You argued this better than he did. J." Avery, in turn, brought him a thumb drive one evening with a mock trial recording she thought he'd appreciate. "You said you missed law," she shrugged. "Thought this might scratch the itch." They never talked about what was happening between them. The age difference still sat quietly in the background, along with the unspoken class gap, her living in a shared apartment with two roommates who stole her almond milk, and him. Well, he had a driver and a view of the Potomac. But in their little pocket of shared space, the cafe, the law library, the occasional park bench when the sun came out, they found a kind of rhythm that made the other parts fade. One evening, as they walked out of a lecture together, Avery nudged him lightly with her shoulder. "You know this is weird, right?" Julian looked at her, the city lights catching faint lines around his eyes. "Very. And you're not going to do something dramatic and disappear just because it's weird." "I don't usually disappear," he said, "at least not without giving notice." Avery grinned. "That's oddly comforting." He paused, then offered his hand. Not romantic, not forced, just a quiet invitation to share the walk. She took it. They didn't need to label anything. Not yet. Whatever it was, growing slowly like something cautious but undeniable, it was theirs. And for now, that was enough. It was never officially called a date. Julian simply texted one afternoon, "If you're not buried in briefs and citations, there's a sculpture garden that looks less terrible at night. Care to walk?" Avery stared at the message longer than necessary. She was, in fact, buried in briefs and citations, but she also hadn't stopped thinking about him all week. "Meet you there at 7:30 p.m., she typed back. The National Gallery's sculpture garden had emptied out by the time they arrived. The sky was fading into deep blue, and the fountains had gone still. Street lamps cast long shadows across the stone paths, softening everything in gold. Julian wore a dark coat and scarf, understated but unmistakably elegant. Avery had thrown on an oversized sweater and a pair of boots that had seen better semesters. They walked without much direction, speaking quietly at first. The conversation drifted between topics: a recent legal scandal, A Professor Avery couldn't stand. Julian's story about a senator who once mistook him for a waiter at a gala. Each step seemed to loosen something between them, each glance growing a little longer. Eventually, they sat on the edge of a low concrete bench beneath a willow tree. Silence fell, but it wasn't awkward. Julian broke it first. "I used to think ambition was everything," he said, his voice lower now. "That if I built the right structure, said the right words, negotiated hard enough, I could shape the world." Avery looked over at him. "And now?" "I think I shaped myself into someone I don't always recognize," he admitted. "Not all of it's bad, but some days I wonder what it cost." The honesty startled her, not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare, clean, unadorned. She nodded slowly, letting the quiet sit for a beat before answering. "I feel like I'm standing on a cliff edge most of the time," she said. "Like if I slip up once, just once, everything I've worked for disappears. I don't come from money. I don't have a safety net. I can't afford to not care." Julian turned toward her, his expression unreadable at first. Then he said gently, "That's not a weakness, that's clarity." For a moment, neither of them looked away. There was no kiss, no grand gesture, just something warmer, a shared truth, sitting between them like a small fire against the dark. As they stood to leave, Avery touched his arm lightly. "Thanks for tonight," she said. "I don't do this often, I don't let people in." "Then I won't take it lightly," Julian replied, "and I won't take it for granted." They walked back toward the metro in comfortable silence, the city glowing around them. "Just before parting ways," he said, "don't disappear on me, Kim." She smiled, "Not unless you do first." They didn't call it a date, but they both knew it was. The law library was unusually quiet that evening, a stillness heavy with pressure. Finals were approaching, but Avery's mind wasn't on exams anymore. Her attention had shifted to something more consuming, her thesis. Stacks of articles were spread across the long wooden table. A notepad lay open beside her laptop, filled with bullet points, arrows, crossed-out phrases, and scribbled questions like, "What legal duty does a lobbyist owe the public?" And "Where's the line between advocacy and manipulation?" She had changed topics 2 weeks earlier, abandoning her initial plan to write about tort reform. It felt too safe, too theoretical. She wanted to write something that mattered, something that looked at the real mechanisms of power in Washington. So she turned her focus to lobbying, especially the murky ethical terrain where corporate influence met government policy. It didn't take long for one particular case to stand out. A pharmaceutical conglomerate embroiled in controversy over inflated pricing, aggressive patent extensions, and deep-pocketed influence campaigns in Congress. Whistleblowers had hinted at something darker, the use of shell organizations to block legislation and suppress investigative journalism. The company's name showed up over and over again in lobbying disclosures, campaign donations, and policy memos. Avery's professor had approved the new direction with cautious enthusiasm. "Just be ready," she'd warned. "This isn't theory anymore. You're poking at real institutions. Be smart." Avery didn't flinch. She thrived in pressure. She spent hours combing through public records, matching dates and signatures, chasing down corporate filings like puzzle pieces. The more she read, the more confident she became that this company, Celadon Biotech, was the perfect centerpiece for her paper. Late one night, she leaned back in her chair and stared at her screen, eyes burning from too much blue light. She just found an archived lobbying report from 3 years ago. The firm listed as Celadon's lead representative on a controversial healthcare bill, Sinclair and Morrison Strategies. She blinked. The name didn't register at first. She clicked on the firm's profile, then scrolled, and then she saw it. CEO, Julian Sinclair. Avery froze. She stared at the screen, her mind a rush of contradiction. No, it had to be coincidence. The name wasn't uncommon, but she knew it wasn't coincidence. The moment she saw his face on the firm's website, smiling, composed, exactly how he looked across from her in the cafe, everything turned sharp. The notes she had taken earlier blurred in her mind. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, motionless. She stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back too fast. A nearby student glanced at her, startled, but Avery didn't notice. She left the library and stepped into the cold night air, breathing in shallow pulls. Julian Sinclair, the man who made her laugh, the one who listened to her, who spoke about regret like someone who meant it. And now he was tied to the company at the heart of her thesis, a company she was prepared to expose. The realization wasn't just uncomfortable. It cracked something subtle but deep. They met again 2 days later, back in their usual booth at the cafe. The air between them was still, but charged like a violin string pulled taut but not yet played. Avery had thought about canceling. She almost did. But curiosity, or maybe the hope that something she felt was still real, pulled her there. Julian was already seated, sipping tea for once, not coffee. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before, not from lack of sleep, but from something heavier. "You okay?" she asked, settling in across from him. He glanced up, managing a faint smile. "Just a long week." She waited, letting the silence stretch a little, and then he spoke. "There are days," he said slowly, "when I look at everything I've built, all the influence I've gathered, and wonder if any of it really matters." Avery studied him. What brought that on? Meetings, reports, clients who want to twist policy into something unrecognizable, all while smiling and quoting their mission statements. He shook his head slightly. "I used to believe in shaping policy. Now I spend most of my time cleaning up after the people who abuse it." She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to reach out, reassure him. Another part wanted to scream, "Then why keep doing it?" Instead, she said carefully, "Do you ever think about walking away from it?" Julian looked out the window. "More than I used to, but I built this firm, I gave it my name. I carry 1,000 quiet obligations." The words sat with her. She wanted to tell him, she almost did, about Celadon, about her thesis, about how the more she dug, the uglier it became. But every time the truth reached her throat, it tangled there. She couldn't bring herself to say it, not when he looked so open, so raw. Instead, she asked, "Do you ever regret it, lobbying?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But regret doesn't come with a clear path forward, just shadows of what could have been." She stared down at her cup. What if someone held a mirror up to all of it? What if they challenged it, even exposed it? Julian gave a dry smile. "Then I'd hope they did their homework and didn't stop halfway." Avery's stomach turned. He had no idea he was speaking to that person, the one holding the mirror, the one ready to write it all down. They sat in silence for a while after that, sipping slowly, each trapped in thoughts neither was quite ready to share. And though they still smiled as they said goodbye, it didn't feel like all their other goodbyes. It felt like they were both starting to hear the ticking of something they hadn't dared name. Avery had always trusted the research process more than her instincts. She believed in facts, in paper trails, in source citations, not gut feelings. But this time, the unease hit her before she found the proof. She had been building a timeline of Celadon Biotech's lobbying activity. The more she dug, the more disturbing the pattern became. Legislation stalled, watchdog bills quietly rewritten, health policy language that once protected consumers diluted beyond recognition. And in the background, always in the background, were the same initials, S&M Strategies. At first she skimmed past them. Sinclair and Morrison, just another polished firm in a sea of polished firms. But then, somewhere between the 8th and 9th lobbying report, she stopped mid-scroll. The memo from 3 years ago had an attached email. It was signed off by J.S. Avery stared at it for a long time. The initials alone could mean anything. But the timestamp matched a key policy shift that had gutted the state's drug pricing law, the very policy she was building her thesis around. She clicked open the accompanying disclosure form, scanned down, and saw it. Contact Julian Sinclair, managing partner. It hit like cold water. She closed her laptop, heart pounding in her ears, sat there for a moment in stunned silence, then opened it again. Now she wasn't skimming. She was combing through every archived page from Sinclair and Morrison's website. Their client list was sleek, vague, and filled with phrases like policy strategy and cross-sector advocacy. Celadon wasn't listed publicly. Of course it wasn't, but her discovery matched reporting from an independent watchdog group 2 years prior that had quietly named Sinclair's firm as one of several shadow representatives for corporate lobbying. Her hands trembled slightly as she returned to her own thesis outline. Section 3.2. The use of external lobbying firms to obfuscate corporate political pressure. And now she knew Julian's firm wasn't just a case study. It was the case. She leaned back, breath shallow. How had she not seen it sooner? The man who had quoted Justice Brandeis to her over espresso, who had walked with her beneath the glow of sculpture lights, who had admitted doubts and regrets with an honesty that had stirred something deep in her. He was part of the machine she was trying to dissect. The questions crowded her brain. Had he known all along what she was writing about? Was he playing her? Or was this just a city where everyone's integrity eventually blurred? Avery closed the laptop slowly, like it had just revealed a secret it hadn't meant to share. She sat in the empty corner of the library, silent except for the hum of the lights, as the line between her academic ambition and her personal life dissolved into a mess of conflict. And for the first time since she started law school, she wasn't sure what came next. The days that followed were restless in a way Avery couldn't fully name. She moved through her routines like someone wearing borrowed skin, smiling at customers, nodding through lectures, highlighting cases she couldn't remember reading. But inside, her mind churned constantly, looping through the same dilemma: tell Julian the truth or keep going in silence. She chose silence for now. Her thesis draft grew in secret. She worked on it late at night, long after her roommates had gone to bed, the only light in her apartment the glow from her laptop screen. The words came harder now. She double-checked every source, reread every sentence, terrified of making a misstep not just academically but ethically. She wasn't just writing about corruption anymore. She was writing about him. And yet she couldn't stop. The deeper she went, the more the story needed to be told, not as revenge, not even as justice, but as truth. It had become bigger than her. Meanwhile, Julian reached out less. Their texts grew shorter. Their conversations, when they did meet, became laced with pauses that hadn't existed before. Something was changing, and he felt it. One Thursday evening, he dropped by the cafe unannounced, catching her just as she was clocking out. He was in his usual coat, but his expression was less composed than usual, like he just walked out of a meeting that didn't end well. "Walk with me?" he asked. Avery hesitated, then nodded. They strolled along the edge of the canal, the water shimmering beneath soft orange streetlights. Julian didn't say anything at first. When he finally spoke, it was quiet. "You've been distant." She glanced at him. "I've been busy." "You were always busy. This is different." Avery looked away, jaw tight. Law school doesn't get easier just because someone asking questions. "I'm not just anyone," he said, not accusing, more like a confession. That stopped her. He looked at her, then really looked at her. "Did I do something? Say something." "No," she said quickly, too quickly. "Avery." She opened her mouth, then closed it. The truth hovered just behind her teeth. "I'm just overwhelmed," she said finally, voice low. "Trying to finish my thesis, trying to get everything right." Julian nodded slowly, though she could see the doubt in his eyes. "You can talk to me, you know that." She nodded but didn't talk. He let out a breath. If there's something you're not saying, I hope you'll trust me enough to say it, sooner or later. She forced a small smile. I will. But she didn't. That night she lay awake long after midnight, her draft open beside her, cursor blinking over the names Sinclair and Morrison. She couldn't tell him, not yet, because she didn't know if she was ready for what it might destroy. The confession came not with a storm, but in a quiet moment when neither of them had expected anything important to be said. They were sitting on the rooftop of Julian's building, a rare space of calm above the chaos of the city. The sky was hazy, tinged lavender by the last remnants of sunset, and the hum of DC traffic below felt distant, almost unreal. Avery had arrived late, exhausted but unable to say no when he'd texted her simply, "Rooftop." She hadn't planned to say anything. She told herself she was just there to breathe, to feel something normal again. But somewhere between the second glass of wine and Julian's story about an old senator mistaking a motion to adjourn for a dinner invitation, her guard began to loosen. Julian turned to her, sensing the shift. "You've been somewhere else all night." "I'm here," she replied softly, eyes on the skyline. "But not really." She hesitated, then said, "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "If someone you cared about, trusted, was doing work that conflicted with something you believed in, something you were working on, how would you handle it?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "I want to know what exactly we're talking about." Avery looked down at her hands. "Say it's a thesis," she said, "about power, influence, the way corporations can use the law to reshape the world quietly without oversight." He didn't speak. She went on carefully. "What if the research, the truth, pointed to a company being part of that problem? And what if the person I cared about was connected to that company or that system?" Julian's face didn't move, but something behind his eyes flickered. "Are you talking about me?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "Not directly. I'm not naming names, I need to know. What would you do if you were in my position?" Julian was quiet for a long moment. His gaze turned toward the glowing dome of the Capitol in the distance. "I'd want to be honest," he said, "but I'd also ask myself, is the goal to punish the person or to change the system?" Avery looked at him. "What if it's both?" He gave a faint, sad smile. "Then I'd brace myself for some damage." The wind lifted slightly, brushing Avery's hair across her cheek. "I'm scared I'll lose something important," she admitted. Julian turned to her again. "Then maybe what you need to ask is it worth losing if it means standing by what you believe?" She swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Neither of them spoke after that. They sat in silence, side by side, not touching, the air between them stretched tight with the weight of what had almost been said. And for the first time, Julian didn't try to close the space between them. Because he, too, was beginning to guess what lay beneath her words. Julian sat alone in his office, long after the rest of the floor had gone dark. The city lights outside glittered like broken glass, casting reflections onto the wall of windows that framed his corner view. The quiet inside was absolute, no emails chiming, no assistants knocking, no voices echoing down the polished hallways. Just the low hum of HVAC and the steady tick of the antique clock he'd inherited from his father. Avery's words from the rooftop played on repeat in his mind. What if the person I cared about was connected to the problem? He had known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that this moment would come. That one day, his carefully drawn lines would blur. That someone smart, someone principled, would look past the suits and the dinners and the polished press releases and see it. And the worst part, she hadn't even said the name Celadon, but he already knew. He leaned forward at his desk and opened a secure folder on his computer, internal reports, strategy decks, compliance memos, all tied to Celadon Biotech. For years, Sinclair and Morrison had been crafting the company's policy shield, helping them reframe predatory pricing as innovation incentives, burying legislative resistance in committee, and maintaining public goodwill through carefully timed donations to medical charities. Julian hadn't handled the account personally in over a year, but his name was still on the paperwork, and when Celadon's CEO called, he still answered. He scrolled through the latest report, then paused on a line he'd seen before but had never truly read. Maintain aggressive posture toward patient advocacy groups. Offer limited engagement to reduce risk of policy exposure. It wasn't just a strategy, it was a dismissal of harm. And for the first time in a long time, Julian saw it for what it was. He stood up, walked to the window, and pressed a hand against the glass. The reflection that looked back at him was tired, controlled. The same man who had once argued in front of the D.C. Circuit Court, who had built this empire with precision and polish, and now found himself slowly cracking under the weight of all he justified. Could he afford to confront the client? Celadon paid for half the firm's staff. If he pulled the plug, the board would revolt, partners would walk, his reputation would shift from strategic to unstable, weak. But could he live with doing nothing? That was the real question, the one Avery had never asked outright, but had planted like a seed in his chest. He picked up his phone and typed a message, then erased it. Then tried again. "Can we talk soon? There's something I want you to see." But he didn't send it. Not yet. Instead, he sat back down, pulled the folder closer, and started reading it all again, this time not as a CEO, but as a man trying to remember what integrity was supposed to feel like. They met in the courtyard behind the cafe, neutral ground. It was nearly empty, save for a few students with headphones and an elderly couple sharing a bench. The wind carried the scent of spring and tension. Julian stood with his hands in the pockets of his coat, his face unreadable. Avery sat on the edge of a low stone planter, her laptop bag slung at her side, fingers fidgeting with the zipper. She looked up first. "You said you wanted to talk." "I did." He paused, then added carefully, "I've read through the reports. I know what Celadon's done, or at least, what they've allowed to happen." Avery's eyes flickered. She said nothing. Julian stepped closer. "And I know your thesis, even without seeing it, is heading straight toward them." She didn't blink. "I'm not going after them personally. I'm writing about a pattern. Celadon just happens to be the most visible example. You know how this town works, Avery. A paper like that, especially coming from someone as sharp as you, gets picked up, shared, cited. You could be publishing the spark that sets off an entire firestorm." She folded her arms. So I'm asking you to wait." The silence that followed was thick. "Wait," she repeated. "For what?" "For this to settle," Julian said. "For me to make some moves internally, quietly. I'm not defending them, but I need time. If this hits now, I lose leverage. The firm implodes. I can't fix anything if I'm out of the room." Avery stared at him, incredulous. "You want me to slow down my work, my graduation, my entire point, so you can preserve your seat at the table?" "It's not about me." "Yes," she snapped, standing. "It is. You're asking me to compromise my voice so you can preserve your image as the guy who's trying his best. But you've been part of the problem for years. You just didn't want to look too closely." Julian's jaw tightened. "You think I don't carry this with me, that I don't question it every time I sign a contract or step into a meeting?" "Then do something," she said, voice sharp. "You don't get to talk about integrity while you ask other people to stay quiet." He took a slow breath. "You're young. You think truth and impact are the same thing. But sometimes the world doesn't change because you're right. It changes when you're strategic." She stared at him, hurt flashing behind her eyes. And there it is, the cynicism dressed up as wisdom. Julian stepped back slightly. "I'm trying to protect something bigger than either of us." "No," she said softly, "you're trying to protect what you built. and I'm not asking you to tear it down. I'm just not going to help hold it up." He didn't respond. The wind rustled the trees above them. A student nearby laughed into a phone, oblivious to the silence breaking between two people at the edge of something fragile. Avery finally stepped away. "I have to finish what I started." Julian didn't stop her. He watched as she walked off, her shoulders stiff, her pace steady. And for the first time since they met, he didn't know if she'd come back. Days turned into weeks. Neither of them reached out. Avery buried herself in her thesis like it was the only thing left holding her together. She stopped lingering at the cafe after shifts, stopped looking up when the door chimed. Her routine became mechanical: wake up, read, write, revise, repeat. The paper grew quickly, sharper, clearer, more unflinching with every draft. Her professors noticed. So did her classmates, but none of their praise softened the hollowness that settled beneath her ribs. She didn't talk about Julian. Not to her roommates, not to her mentor, not even to herself, really. The absence sat like a bruise, deep, quiet, and tender. Some part of her had hoped he'd fight harder or maybe just understand. Instead, all she had now were long nights and a growing list of citations that made her feel more alone than accomplished. Meanwhile, across the river, Julian was unraveling in his own way. He still wore the suit, still showed up to meetings, still delivered confident pitches and negotiated backdoor compromises with members of Congress, but he couldn't unhear her words. "You're not asking me to fix anything. You're asking me to stay quiet." Every time he stepped into a boardroom, it echoed. Every time he reviewed a client brief, he paused longer than he used to. He'd always told himself his work was about influence, about bending policy toward the possible. But now, that word felt like a shield. Influence. The thing people claimed when they didn't want to admit they were no longer making a difference. He started leaving the office earlier, walked the long way home. Once he passed the law library at Georgetown and nearly went in, but he didn't. At night, he reread her note, the same one she'd given him by accident. He hadn't thrown it away. Couldn't. It still sat tucked in his desk drawer, next to the pen he used for signing contracts and the watch his father gave him on his first court win. The ink had faded slightly from the fold. Law shouldn't be about power. It should be about clarity, about truth. He wondered when he'd started believing that couldn't be true anymore. He missed her, not just the late-night conversations and the way she challenged him without trying to win, but the version of himself he saw reflected in her eyes, the one who still gave a damn. But he didn't call, and neither did she. And so they drifted, both in motion, both becoming something else, growing quietly, painfully apart. Avery's final paper was due in 3 days. The pages stretched out in front of her, raw with citations and bold assertions, each sentence a step away from the world she'd once shared with Julian. She had barely slept the past few nights, the weight of the thesis pulling at her from every direction. The lines of text on the screen blurred in the early morning light, but it didn't matter anymore. It was done. But there was still the nagging feeling in her chest, the one that whispered what if every time she closed her eyes, reminding her that nothing had really been resolved, not with Julian, not with herself. She had avoided him, in part out of stubbornness, in part because she wasn't sure where to go from there. She couldn't deny that the connection they shared was real, but could love truly exist when the very core of what they believed in had fractured so irreparably? She stared at the last paragraph of her thesis, the question she hadn't yet answered. Can the law, in its purest form, serve both justice and power? Or is that just an illusion created by those who wield it? Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. An email from her professor. She opened it. A subject line she didn't expect. "Avery, you should know we've been following your work closely. Let's discuss your paper in person after you submit it." It wasn't the praise she'd been hopping for, but the weight of the words still carried an undeniable validation. She had done it. She had written a paper that mattered, But did it matter in the way that had once seemed so simple? The answer was still unclear. Julian spent his evenings in the quiet of his apartment, alone with his thoughts, surrounded by the very luxury he had once believed was the reward for all the ambition he'd poured into his work. The board meetings, the handshakes, the polished presentations, they had all become a hollow routine. Celadon was still a lucrative client, still pushing against legislative reform, still feeding the machine. He hadn't pulled the plug, hadn't made any of the changes he had promised himself he would. Instead, he had thrown himself into his work, pretending the questions Avery had raised didn't matter. But every night, when the office lights went out, and the suits and power plays were no longer within reach, the same question followed him home. Can love exist where principles diverge? He knew what Avery would say. She would tell him that the truth had no room for compromise, that if something was wrong, you didn't stay silent. And part of him believed that. That was the part of him that had first decided to become a lawyer, to fight for the better world he thought was possible. But as the days went on, that part of him had become harder to hear. The part that was part of the system, that had benefited from it. The part that had once told Avery it wasn't just about being right, but about being strategic. He stared at his phone late one night. There was a message from her, unopened. He had seen it come in, a few days ago, but he hadn't been able to bring himself to open it. What would he say? He still hadn't figured it out. The day Avery submitted her thesis was the same day Julian sat down in a quiet corner of his office, facing a stack of paperwork that felt more like a wall than a task. The question gnawed at him still, and when he looked up, his phone buzzed with a notification, an invitation to a public panel on lobbying reform, one he had reluctantly agreed to months ago. The thought of standing in front of a crowd, speaking about his firm's influence, made him sick. But something shifted in that moment. He could feel it deep in his chest. What if you could be more than just the person at the top of this machine? He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over her name. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he couldn't keep avoiding the question. Not anymore. The next morning, Avery's phone rang just after she finished her final edits. She almost didn't pick it up. She didn't have the strength to dive back into their history, back into the complicated mess of emotions she had tucked away. But she pressed accept before her mind could tell her not to. Hey, Julian's voice came through the speaker, more familiar than she expected. I've been thinking about a lot of things, about you, about us. Avery felt her chest tighten, but she forced herself to listen. I don't know if we can find a way back from everything, from what I'm a part of, from where I've been, Julian continued, his voice quieter now. But I can't keep pretending like I don't care about you, that this doesn't matter. Avery exhaled slowly, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on her. I don't know if I can forgive you for staying silent, for being part of it all. I get it, I do, but maybe I don't need you to forgive me. Maybe I just need to try to be better, for you, for the people who deserve something different. Her throat felt tight. She wanted to say so much, but instead she whispered, I don't know what that means for us. I don't either, Julian admitted, but I want to find out. Avery closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. She didn't know if love could exist between them anymore, not with the path they'd each walked. But somewhere, deep inside, she also knew that the question, the one that had haunted her for so long, was still the same. Can love exist where principles diverge? The answer wasn't simple, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could figure it out, together. The boardroom was cold, the sterile glass walls reflecting back the polished surface of the conference table. Julian sat at the head, his hands resting lightly on the polished wood, his eyes scanning the faces of the executives around him. They had gathered quickly, the emergency meeting called with a single subject line in his email, Ethics Reform Proposal. He had prepared himself for resistance. He knew they would push back. Change like this, within a system as powerful and entrenched as theirs, didn't come without cost, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Thank you for meeting on short notice, Julian began, his voice steady, though there was a tightness in his chest. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind, but now that he was standing here, he couldn't quite shake the weight of the stakes. I want to talk about our firm's future and what we stand for moving forward. He paused, letting his words sink in. The murmurs around the table died down, and he felt the room shift. We have long prided ourselves on being at the forefront of strategic advocacy, but it's become increasingly clear to me that our current practices are at odds with our long-term goals, Julian continued. It's time we ask ourselves, what do we truly want to represent? A few of the board members shifted in their seats, exchanging cautious glances. Julian pushed forward, not giving them room to interrupt. I propose we create an ethics reform division, a new department tasked with assessing our current clients, analyzing their practices, and advising on policy that truly promotes public good rather than corporate profit at the expense of the people who need it most. The silence in the room was palpable. One of the senior partners, Howard Thompson, cleared his throat, his voice low but sharp. Julian, with all due respect, this sounds like an overreaction. We are a business, not a think tank for social reform. You're asking us to abandon the very clients that have made us successful. Celadon Biotech, for one, is critical to our bottom line. Julian's gaze hardened, but he remained calm. I'm not asking us to abandon anyone. I'm asking us to do what we've always claimed we do, strategically shape policy. But this time, let's do it with integrity. Let's take a stand for the future. Another board member, Marissa Green, a sharp-tongued partner with years of experience, leaned forward. Are you suggesting we refuse clients like Celadon because they don't fit the moral mold you're creating in your head? Julian, this is a slippery slope. If we start making moral judgments about our clients, we risk losing all credibility. I'm suggesting we stop justifying unethical practices because they're profitable, Julian shot back, his voice firm. We're sitting on the edge of a precipice. We can either evolve or we can sink deeper into a system that's already broken. The room grew tense, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Howard's voice rose. We're not a non-profit, Julian. You're asking us to upend years of successful business for something that could cost us millions. Your personal agenda is clouding your judgment. My judgment is not clouded, Julian said, his eyes scanning the room, his voice steady but laced with a conviction he hadn't known he was capable of. I'm seeing this for what it is. We've been pushing policies that harm people. I've seen it. I've helped perpetuate it, and I refuse to keep ignoring it. A moment of silence passed, thick with disbelief and uncertainty. Marissa leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. So, what's your plan here, Julian? To alienate half of our clients with a wave of your moral compass? You think we're going to just put them through some ethics check and suddenly become the heroes of the lobbying world? Julian took a deep breath, steadying himself. I'm not asking for perfection, but I am asking for accountability. We don't have to give up our clients, but we need to put systems in place that ensure we're not enabling exploitation. I believe we can evolve and still thrive, but it will require us to challenge everything we've been doing. The room fell into a stunned silence. Julian's eyes flickered over the faces of the people he had worked with for years, some of them friends, others mentors. But he could feel it, the resistance, the fear, the reluctance to change. The threat of losing the status quo was too great for most of them. But then, at the far end of the table, a voice broke through the tension. It was Michael, the firm's lead senior counsel, someone who had always been skeptical but respected Julian's tenacity. He sighed, leaning forward. I get it, Julian, Michael said quietly. I don't like the direction this is going either, but I've been in this game long enough to know that playing by new rules isn't just risky, it's revolutionary. We can't just dismantle everything without a plan. Julian nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement. I'm not asking for revolution overnight. What I'm proposing is a pilot program. We start small. Identify one or two clients who have shown signs of wanting to do better and work with them to build a model. A model that demonstrates we can balance profitability with ethical responsibility. The room was still, but the momentum had shifted, even if just a little. Let's at least start the conversation, Julian added. We'll test it, evaluate it, and see what works. If it doesn't, then we'll reevaluate. But I need your support to get this off the ground. For a moment there was no response, but then Michael spoke again, more quietly. I'll back you on this, Julian, but you need to convince the others. Julian felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew the fight was far from over. This wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick, but it was the first step. Slowly, one by one, other board members spoke, some in favor, some still uncertain, but all agreeing to move forward with a pilot program. Julian exhaled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. As the meeting concluded and the room emptied, he stood at the head of the table, looking out at the city below. It wasn't the victory he had hoped for, but it was a beginning. And that, for now, was enough. He had started the change from within. The next few days were a blur for Avery. She had handed in her thesis draft to her professor with the same sense of nervous anticipation that had followed her through every paper she'd written in the last 2 years. But now, there was a quiet storm brewing in her mind. The research was still the same, the flawed systems of power, the ethical rot lurking beneath the surface of corporate lobbying, the policies that were crafted not with public good in mind, but with corporate interests fueling every decision. But there was a new, nagging question she couldn't shake. What's the point if I can't change anything? She had written the words she believed needed to be said, but they now felt incomplete, tainted by the personal conflict she hadn't fully acknowledged. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she wasn't just writing about systems anymore, she was writing about Julian, about his company. She couldn't avoid it, but she couldn't let her anger define the work either. She sat down one evening, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, feeling the weight of every decision that had brought her to this point. What if I rewrote it? The thought had been hovering at the edge of her mind for a while, but tonight it seemed clearer. She wasn't writing a paper to tear down everything. She was writing to build a bridge, to explore how change could come from within systems that were too powerful to collapse overnight. She opened her laptop, erasing the harsh, accusatory sentences she had written about Sinclair and Morrison, about Celadon, about the corporate forces she had once been so eager to expose. She paused, fingers stilling over the keys. Instead of focusing on who was responsible, she decided to focus on how the system could evolve. She shifted her lens toward structural reform, the idea that real, long-term change didn't come from dismantling the system entirely, but from reforming it from the inside. With a deep breath, she began to write. Her new thesis outlined a vision for the future, one where lobbying could still play a role, but with transparency, accountability, and ethical standards at its core. She drew from the recent wave of corporate social responsibility movements, the legal and policy reforms aimed at reducing corporate influence on politics, and the gradual rise of watchdog organizations that monitored the political contributions of major firms. Instead of just critiquing the industry, she explored possibilities for creating checks and balances within it. She examined how lobbying firms could implement internal ethics divisions, similar to the one Julian had proposed, and how companies could self-regulate their lobbying efforts to align with public interest. She used Julian's suggestion to create a pilot program as a case study, proposing it as a model for how firms could balance the interests of their clients with the greater good. Avery dove deeper into the idea of corporate responsibility, focusing on how lobbying efforts could be used not just to protect the interests of big corporations, but also to advance policies that addressed pressing social issues like healthcare, the environment, and income inequality. She used her own experiences in law school to emphasize the importance of cultivating lawyers who weren't just skilled in law, but who were also ethically driven to use their talents to shape policy in a way that benefited society as a whole. As the hours passed, she found herself writing with more conviction than she had in weeks. She was no longer just a critic, she was a reformer. She wasn't letting the system off the hook, but she was offering a pathway out of the darkness, a blueprint for how things could be different. When she submitted the revised draft, she felt lighter. Not because it was easier, but because it felt truer to what she had learned, both from her research and from the time she had spent with Julian. She still disagreed with many of his choices, still questioned the work Sinclair and Morrison did, but she understood that true change wasn't about tearing everything down. It was about challenging it from within, creating space for a more ethical future without burning the whole system to the ground. And in a way, it felt like her thesis was a quiet acknowledgement of their shared experience. She wasn't erasing the truth, but she was shifting it, letting it breathe and grow into something more constructive, just as she had come to realize her own beliefs could. She didn't know what would happen after she graduated, or where her relationship with Julian would go. She had let go of the expectation that it would be easy or clean. But in that moment, as she clicked the submit button on her final draft, Avery felt like she had created a bridge, not just for the system, but for herself. It wasn't the end of the road, but it was a new beginning. Avery stood in front of the room, her heart pounding against her ribs, the soft hum of the overhead projector her only companion. The defense committee, 3 professors whose names she had memorized but whose faces still intimidated her, sat at the long wooden table in front of her. Their eyes were sharp, assessing as they always were. But this time, Avery felt different. She wasn't just presenting her thesis for a grade. She was presenting it for herself. She took a deep breath and began. Good afternoon, everyone. My thesis is focused on the intersection between lobbying practices and ethical reform, specifically how the lobbying industry can evolve from within to become a force for good. Instead of viewing lobbying solely as a tool for corporate power, I argue that it can be a critical instrument for advancing public policy that serves both the interests of the people and the private sector. Through the creation of internal ethics divisions and a shift toward transparency, lobbying firms could balance influence with accountability. Her voice was steady, her hands, though slightly trembling, were poised. She glanced at the professors. Their expressions were unreadable, but she could see the glimmers of interest. She had anticipated their questions, practiced the answers, and prepared for every possible challenge. But as she continued, talking through her evidence and the case studies she had built into her paper, something in her shifted. She wasn't just reciting words anymore. She believed in what she was saying, the reform she envisioned, the bridge between ideals and pragmatism that she had built so carefully. A few minutes in, one of her professors, Dr. Thompson, raised his hand. Avery, you've proposed that firms like Sinclair and Morrison could lead the charge on reform. But given the nature of lobbying as a highly competitive industry, do you truly believe they will voluntarily choose to prioritize ethics over profit? Avery paused, taking a deep breath. She had prepared for this. She had thought about it, had spent hours in the library debating the question with herself. She looked at Dr. Thompson, then around at the other professors and responded. I don't believe that firms will suddenly, overnight, choose ethics over profit. But I do believe in the power of gradual systemic change. Lobbying firms, like all businesses, respond to both market forces and social pressures. If clients and consumers begin to demand transparency, if regulatory bodies impose stricter oversight, and if firms see that long-term profitability can be achieved through responsible advocacy, the system can change. This is about shifting the culture of lobbying, not forcing an immediate transformation, but guiding it toward a more accountable model. She could feel the intensity in the room shifting. It wasn't just about the content of her argument anymore. It was about how she was delivering it, with conviction, with clarity. The committee seemed to be listening more intently, their usual scrutiny giving way to genuine consideration. As she finished her presentation and prepared to answer more questions, Her gaze flickered toward the back of the room. She didn't expect to see him there. Julian. He was seated near the back of the lecture hall, hands folded on the table in front of him, his presence almost imperceptible amidst the committee's focus. She caught his eye for a split second, and the sight of him, not as a CEO, not as someone she had once fought with, but as someone who was quietly offering her support, steadied her. He wasn't there for any reason other than to listen, to show that he believed in her. Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay focused. She had come this far, and this was her moment. She wasn't going to let anything derail her now. The questions continued, but with each response, Avery grew more confident. She could feel the respect from the committee members building. She answered every challenge with grace, never flinching, even when they probed her ideas on corporate self-regulation and the potential for lobbying reform to be implemented across the industry. She didn't have all the answers, but she had a vision, and that vision was being heard. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Thompson leaned back in his chair and gave a subtle nod. "Thank you, Avery. That will be all for today." Avery exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders. She had done it. She had presented her work. The room filled with a soft murmur as the committee members exchanged looks, and she took a moment to compose herself. She wasn't sure yet if she had passed, but in her heart, she knew that she had given her best. As the professors filed out of the room, Julian stood up and slowly walked toward her. He didn't say anything at first. He simply stood there, looking at her with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "That was," Julian began, his voice low, "amazing." Avery blinked, a little surprised by the simplicity of his praise but grateful for it all the same. "Thank you. I wasn't sure if I could do it." "You were incredible," he said, his gaze softening. "You're going to change things, Avery. I don't know how yet, but I'm certain of it." Her heart warmed at his words, a feeling that had become both familiar and foreign in the months since their last conversation. She could feel the old connection between them, that unspoken understanding that had always been there, despite everything. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, her voice catching for just a moment. Julian gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I wouldn't have missed it." They stood there for a moment, the weight of what had been said hanging between them. He didn't need to say anything else. Avery felt it, the respect, the belief in her, the subtle but unspoken support. And in that moment it was enough. The hallway outside the lecture hall was filled with the usual noise of students rushing to their next class, papers in hand, laughter and chatter echoing off the walls. But Avery felt like she was standing in a world of her own, the adrenaline from the defense still humming in her veins, her mind buzzing with a mixture of relief and anticipation. She had done it. Her thesis was finished, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had truly found her voice. And then she saw him. Julian was standing a few steps away, leaning against the wall, looking as composed as ever, but there was a softness in his gaze. As soon as their eyes met, she felt a warmth spread through her chest, the tension from earlier in the day slowly ebbing away. "Julian," she said, her voice betraying a hint of surprise. He straightened up, his smile small but genuine. "Hey, I didn't want to miss this." She walked toward him, a rush of gratitude flowing through her. "Thank you for coming. I didn't expect it, but it meant a lot to have you there." Julian nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching as if he was trying to suppress a deeper emotion. "You were incredible, Avery. I told you you were going to blow them away. You didn't just defend your thesis, you made them see things differently. You made me see things differently." Avery felt her heart skip at his words. There had always been a part of her that wanted to impress him, not out of ego, but because his opinion had always carried weight in her mind. And now, hearing this from him, she couldn't help but smile, though there was a trace of vulnerability behind her eyes. "I didn't think I could do it, you know," she admitted, her voice soft. "I was so close to just finishing it and walking away. I didn't know if it was enough, if I was enough." You were more than enough, Julian said, his voice firm but kind. I've seen a lot of brilliant lawyers, but you've got something that most don't. You've got conviction. You don't just follow the rules. You question them and you make the system better because of it. Avery looked at him, and for the first time in a while the distance between them felt smaller. The weight of their past conflicts, their separate paths, faded for just a moment, replaced by something more genuine, more present. I've been thinking a lot, Julian said after a beat, his tone shifting. About everything, about my work, the firm, the things I've been telling myself I can change, but never really doing anything about. Avery raised an eyebrow, curious but hesitant. What do you mean? I've been listening to you, to your thesis, to what you've been saying all along. He paused, running a hand through his hair, a tired but resolute expression crossing his face. I've decided to step back from a few of the clients we've had for years. I'm redirecting the firm's mission. I'm going to push for a shift, one that focuses more on ethical advocacy and less on the profit-driven, behind-the-scenes deals that I've been part of for too long. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. But I'm starting. Avery stood still for a moment, processing what he had said, the implications of it all. You're serious. He nodded, his eyes locking onto hers. I am. I've been part of a system that's always been about power over people, about defending clients no matter the cost. But I've realized I can't keep doing that. Not when I know better. Not when I've seen the harm it causes. I need to change, and that means changing the firm, changing how I approach everything. Avery felt a rush of emotions, disbelief, hope, and a deep sense of something unspoken. This was it. This was the change she had been waiting for, the moment she had been fighting for in her thesis, the idea that real transformation could come from within the system. But hearing it from him, from someone who had lived in that world for so long, made it feel possible. That's incredible, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never thought I'd hear you say that. I wasn't sure I'd say it either, Julian confessed, a small smile tugging at his lips. But you've made me see that it's not just about what I've built, it's about what I can rebuild, the kind of legacy I want to leave. And I know that won't happen if I keep turning a blind eye to the things that need to change. Avery felt a lump form in her throat, the weight of his words settling deep within her chest. It wasn't just the professional side of things, it was the personal side too. The way Julian had shifted, the way he was opening himself up to the possibility of change, felt like a turning point for both of them. I don't know where this goes from here, Julian said quietly, his voice softer now. But I want you to know that I'm here. I'm here for the change you've always talked about. I'm here for whatever you need. Avery nodded slowly, a smile tugging at her lips. We've both got a lot of work to do, but I'm glad we're doing it together. They stood there, the space between them no longer filled with uncertainty, but with an unspoken understanding. Things were far from perfect. They were still figuring out who they were in this new phase of their lives. But for the first time in a long while, Avery felt like she wasn't alone in the fight. Thank you, Julian, she said quietly, looking up at him with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something that had always lingered beneath the surface between them. For everything. He smiled, the weight of their shared history resting in the small moment. Anytime, Avery, anytime. And as they stood together in that quiet hallway, a sense of calm settled over them. It wasn't an end, but the beginning of something new, something that, for the first time, felt right. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the streets of D.C., the city buzzing with the usual mixture of energy and quiet moments. The pace of life around them seemed to slow as Avery and Julian walked side by side, the sounds of traffic and conversation fading into the background. They hadn't planned this walk, but something about the moment felt like the right time. For the first time in a long while, the distance between them felt like nothing. As they strolled down a familiar street near the National Mall, Julian's hand brushed against Avery, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she glanced at him, a small, unspoken question in her eyes. He met her gaze and offered a soft, reassuring smile, the same one that had grounded her through all the uncertainty, all the confusion. "I never thought we'd end up here," Avery said, her voice low, as if she were still processing how much had changed in just a few months. "I didn't think you'd ever see it like I do, that you'd even want to change things." Julian's eyes softened as he looked at her, his smile widening a bit. "I didn't either," he admitted. "I spent so long convincing myself that the system was just the way it was, that you couldn't fight it, but then I met you." He paused, as though choosing his words carefully. "And you made me realize that doing nothing isn't an option anymore." She smiled, the warmth of his words settling in her chest. "I didn't think you'd come around, not like this." He looked ahead, the weight of the conversation growing heavier. "I think it took me seeing what I was really doing to make me understand. I've been in this world of power and influence for so long, thinking I could change it from the inside, but only by playing by its rules. And I was wrong. I needed to find my own way." Avery nodded. "And now you are." Julian's voice softened. "And so are you. You've shown me that change isn't just about what we say we want. It's about doing the work even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The words lingered between them, full of meaning that both of them had been struggling to find for so long. The change they had each been searching for in themselves, in the world, in their relationship, was no longer something distant, something to come. It was happening right here, in this moment, as they walked together through the city they both called home. Avery took a deep breath, her heart finally lightening. "It's funny, isn't it? All those years of questioning the system, pushing against it, fighting for change. And I never stopped to think about what that would really look like, once we actually got there." "Yeah," Julian said with a half-laugh. "I think I've spent a lot of time thinking I was just one person in a system too big to change. But maybe we're both wrong about that." Avery glanced at him, her eyes searching his face for the same certainty that had been lacking for so long. And then, as they continued walking, their footsteps falling in rhythm, she saw it, the quiet confidence in him, the way he no longer seemed like someone pretending to have it all figured out. He was figuring it out, and so was she. "You know," she said, her voice more relaxed now, "I think we've been too focused on the end game. We've spent so much time thinking we have to fix everything, and maybe we just need to trust that the work we're doing now is enough. That we don't need to know exactly where we're going as long as we're moving toward something better." Julian looked over at her, his expression softening. "Yeah, I think you're right." He stopped walking for a moment, turning toward her fully. "What if the future isn't something we have to build alone? What if we can just build it together?" Her breath caught, and for the first time, she realized how much she had wanted to hear those words from him. How much they both needed the space to evolve, not just as individuals, but together. She reached out, taking his hand in hers, the gesture simple but profound. They stood there for a moment, the city around them continuing on its path, indifferent to the small, transformative change happening in this one corner of it. "We can," she whispered, "together." Julian smiled, his eyes warm and full of possibilities. "Together." And with that, they resumed walking, no longer from two separate worlds, but from the same shared one they were actively building based on respect, change, and for the first time in a long time, love. The city around them was full of challenges, full of systems that needed to be fixed. But for now, in this moment, they had each other, and that felt like the only thing that truly mattered.